So let's talk about trauma a little bit. I started as an individual therapist about 35 years ago. And the first work that I did was working with Vietnam vets on the homeless streets of Los Angeles, who were alcoholic, who were smoking tons of weed, who were taking heroin. And those people were in so much agony, they were in so much pain. I really began to understand at that time the dilemma of trauma. And then I went to Boston, and I worked in the combat zone in Boston, which apparently no longer exists. But the combat zone was the poorest area, black, Puerto Rican, very poor white people who were, again, severely traumatized. And I was working with heroin addicts there. And if you want to see trauma, look at heroin addicts. Look at the people who are killing themselves, who are shooting poison into their veins in order to achieve numbness, such numbness that it's literally killing their brains to achieve numbness. That's where you see lots and lots of trauma. So in that individual work, eventually I went to graduate school. And in graduate school, I met an incredible woman named Lisa Hirschman. And Lisa Hirschman was the graduate student who worked with Judith Herman in the first research on father-daughter incest. And I was immediately hooked. And I started to work with Lisa and learned everything that this wonderful mind had to teach me about incest. And incest became my specialty in work in about 1980. So I worked with incest survivors individually and in couples and in groups. But I really didn't know what the heck I was doing in terms of relationships, not until I met John Gottman in 1985. And we got married very quickly after that, which was not traumatizing. It was really wonderful. Though it was a little bit unpredictable, I must say. So, at that point, I was still working with trauma survivors, and I will never forget one person who I had worked with individually, and she had had a Nazi comandante for a grandfather who had sneaked out of Germany, had come to the United States in 1955. She was born in 1952, and he lived in the barn on their farm. And she was an only child. Her mother was severely depressed. Her father was alcoholic. Was there protection? Mm-mm. So he sadistically sexually abused her. And when she came to see me, she finally, with tremendous guilt and shame, confessed that she had a ritual that she would do in a semi-hypnagogic state of attaching iron clips to her nipples and her genitals, attaching chains to them, and then weighing them down with weights. And as she did that, the pain was excruciating, and she would have an orgasm. She told me that she had never, ever had successful sex after she married her husband. The thing that was amazing is that she'd had incredible sex with him before they married. And I understood from her, she taught me a very important lesson about incest, that once a person marries and commits, they've crossed the line where the partner has become their family member. And as their family member, the incest is reenacted. The terror begins. And so when I began to see her, her situation was that she was sleeping on the floor in a sleeping bag, fully clothed. He was sleeping on the bed fully clothed, and they only had one bedroom, which was why they still slept in that room. But she couldn't be in the same room with him otherwise. And when they were gardening, they still had to garden at least 50 yards apart from each other. They had a big garden. So one of the things that I understood is that there is nothing more sacred than an individual dealing with their trauma in the presence of their partner. So we invited the partner in. She really wanted that partner to understand her trauma, which she had just barely opened herself. He had no idea. And what was so magnificent, as Sue was pointing out, is that she, in confiding, was received with beautiful, loving warmth. Now, one small detail about the situation was that he was very depressed. They hadn't had sex in 7 years. He hadn't been able to be within about 8 feet of her. So he was empathetic, but he wasn't being listened to either. So what was so important was to elicit eventually from him his response to the way that she had to distance. And he had never understood that in light of the trauma. So what became clear, as Sue was pointing out too, there's a lot in common that we have, is that the trauma was a third party in the relationship. There weren't 2 people in the room, there were 3. And the third was the ghost of the trauma that was hovering around them like the specter of death. And it would not allow them peace. It would not allow them connection. So she was continually pushing him away. So what we needed to understand was the role of that specter, that ghost in the relationship, the ghost of her grandfather in particular. And to understand that when she looked into the eyes of her husband, it wasn't her grandfather that she was seeing. It was her husband. And what was so important was to create ways, again, dyadically, for the 2 of them, when they went home, to cope with her terror that as she would shut off into a post-traumatic state, he could ground her. He could say to her, I'm here. I'm your husband. Look into my eyes. I'm the one who loves you. It was a long path to get there. Part of getting there had to do with, he was 6'4", she was 5'2". When they hugged, guess what happened? Where did her face go? What's that look like? It's fellatio, right? That was part of what happened with Grandpa. So we devised ways, as they trusted one another, as they talked more with one another, that he would sit down on a chair, she would come up behind him, and she was able to wrap her arms around him because he was the one who would be vulnerable there, and their heads were at the same height. That was key. And eventually she could move around to the other side to eventually hug him without fear. But it always had to be the heads were at the same level. And they moved after lots and lots and lots of crying and sharing with one another their pain that the role of this ghost had played in their relationship and had sabotaged their relationship. How could they be on the same side against this ghost that kept interfering with the relationship. Eventually they found ways, step by step by step, to move into sexuality again, where she had to be on top. He couldn't be. Her head had to be at the same level as his. His couldn't be higher. So there were many little steps that they took towards achieving beautiful sexual intimacy again. So all of that was possible despite having incest from the age of 6 to 16.